Anyway, so what we did was to go and look at poetry. And I was interested in suicidality because it turns out the most dangerous profession in just about Earth is being a published poet. About a quarter of them commit suicide. And Kate Jamison wrote a wonderful book about this, that poets have a very high rate of bipolar disorder or manic depression. And people with bipolar disorder have a much higher suicide rate. We compared poets who committed suicide with a matched group of poets who did not, and just analyzed their poetry. And I assumed when we started this that we would find that suicidal poets were just more negative and used more negative emotion words. Not true. There's no difference. All poets are kind of depressed. It's in the job description. But what separated these out more than anything was the use of the word I. Suicidal poets use the word I at much higher rates. And if you go and look at the poetry, say, of someone like Sylvia Plath, when she's talking about a depressing topic, you can almost see her embracing her topic. She and the miserable relationship or whatever are essentially the same. And then you look at a non-suicidal poet, say like Denise Levertov, who actually we compared those two because they were born about the same time and educated similarly. When she's talking about a miserable relationship, you can almost see her standing back and holding it at a distance, looking at it in a more third-person kind of perspective. We ended up doing some other projects. Stephanie Root and I did a really interesting project whereby we analyzed the language of students asked to write about coming to college. But she had done all this work where she had done clinical interviews. And so we were able to compare clinically depressed students with never depressed students with previously depressed students. And when just writing about coming to college, the depressed students use the word I at far, far higher rates than non-depressed. Some of the other work that Janet Baddeley's been doing, we've had people, we've done two projects. One is where we essentially put this tape recorder on people and have them wear it. Or we have done a project where we tap people's email. They give us permission to analyze their email over an entire year. And what we were able to do with our depressed sample is almost all of these people have had periods when they're depressed and when they're in remission. And when they're depressed, they use I at much higher rates than when they're not depressed. They also tend to use language differently in these two states, which I can talk about later. A second thing we've been interested in, can we use language as a way to get a sense of how people cope with traumatic experience? Much of my life I've devoted to trying to understand how individuals deal with traumas, both individual and also collective. And we've done a lot of work with collective traumas like September 11th or the Texas A&M bonfire disaster or many, many others. Well, one thing that we've done, for example, is to track blogs of thousands of people. So we did this with 9/11 with actually 1,000 people who used the journal, the blog livejournal.com. And we had, these were high blog users stratified by age, and we had them from 2 months before September 11th to 2 months after. So they had on average 70 blogs entries per person, so in other words 70,000 blogs. Using Luke, we're able to look and see how these people change on a day-by-day basis as a function of September 11th. And what we found was quite striking, I think. First, as soon as September 11th occurred, the people had been using the word I at a really constant rate of about 7%, and then they dropped down to 5.8% immediately, and they stayed at a low level and gradually came up over about the next 2 weeks. Use of the word we essentially doubled. On September 11th, it doubled. And then it gradually came down over the next month. Now, what was interesting, the way they were using we wasn't a nationalistic we. Sometimes it was, but usually not. They were talking about family and close friends in terms of their we. In other words, we're getting a snapshot of the way these people were thinking. We also were able to track their emotion word use. So, for example, negative emotions. What we found was here they were at this rate, and then at September 11th, negative emotions went up, and then they came back down to baseline in about 7 days. So we're also getting a picture of how long emotions last. The most interesting were positive emotions. First of all, here we have September 11th. There's a steep drop on September 11th, and by 4 days they were at baseline, and on the 5th day they went above baseline. And this is a 2-month baseline, and they stayed above baseline for the next 2 months. Traumatic experience brings people together. We've all kind of known that. And what it did was it brought people together, and they started using more compassionate, positive words over the next 2 months. There's another important feature to this, and it really ties into how should we deal with people who have had a traumatic experience. There's been a big brouhaha over the last few years about something called critical incident stress debriefing. After a terrible trauma, should you rush in and have people debrief and talk about their emotions? And there's some people who really push this. And then a few years later, a few years ago, someone pointed out, you know, the research shows that this not only doesn't work, but it seems like it's not beneficial. Well, what's interesting is when you look at all of these traumas, we've looked at several of them now, immediately after a trauma, people use the word I much less. What they're doing is psychologically distancing. The healthy way to deal with a horrible experience is to psychologically distance yourself some. Forcing people to now process their emotions immediately after they occur is probably not a good idea. Now, if they want to do it, fine. But that's not kind of the profile of healthy coping. Now, we've looked at this across many other domains. One, for example, is one that I've loved, is looking at when people are honest or dishonest. Now, here I've been doing this work on writing, and the writing work to me really suggested that people were being truly honest with themselves when they were writing. Could you tell people who were actually being truly dishonest? So we did these linguistic lie detector projects. We brought people in the laboratory, we would have them lie or tell the truth, and there's a lot of different ways that we could do that. And then we would interrogate them sometimes, or we just compare their writings. And we got pretty consistent effects. And then one of the most interesting studies was actually done by Denise Huddle from here in San Antonio. Denise had been a private investigator, and she had contacted me because she wanted to see if she could make a really good lie detector machine. And it turns out that's a real tough thing to do. But what she did, which nobody else has done, is over the next 2 years, she went and was able to get transcripts from trials where people were found guilty, and she found 2 different types. One where people were found guilty, and after they were found guilty, they were also found guilty of perjury. In other words, these people were just terrible people, and they were terrible liars on top of it. But they were found guilty. And then the other half were people who found guilty, but then were exonerated because of DNA or other evidence. And we wanted to see, did they use language differently if they were being honest versus not being honest? Well, what we found was all the studies showed the same general pattern. When people are telling the truth, they tend to use the word I at much higher rates than people who are lying. Again, it's kind of this ownership. When you are telling the truth, you are owning what you're saying, and when you're lying, you are psychologically distancing. Secondly, when people are telling the truth, they tend to be more cognitively complex. They use words that we call exclusive words. These are words like except, but, exclude. These are words where you're making a distinction between what is in a category and what's not in a category. When you're telling the truth, you say, I did this, but I didn't do that. Someone who's lying, that is just way too complex. So the person who is lying over-includes, I did this, and I did this, and I did this, and this. And also, people who are telling the truth tend to be more specific. They tend to use more articles and certain types of references to time and space and so forth. How well do we do? We do pretty well. In our lab studies, which are highly controlled, we catch people at about the rate of about 65, 67%, where 50% is accuracy. And you're thinking, that's pathetic. That's not great. We want 100%. Tell me 98%. That will never happen. However, if we give these transcripts to people to read them, they are accurate 53% of the time, where 50% is chance. If they see videotapes, 57%, where 50% is chance. In other words, we do really well compared to other existing technologies.